After the end of World War II, the world was split into two camps, the capitalist West led by the USA and the socialist East under the leadership of the USSR, whose successor is modern Russia. Between them unfolded not only an ideological but also a technological battle for the superiority of armed forces. The so-called arms race. A dangerous, intense dynamic of mutual deterrence kept the world on the brink of nuclear disaster for decades. Each new development by one side caused a response from the other. But what if Soviet counterintelligence supplied American military engineers with misinformation for several years? Is it possible that the USSR carefully hid a secret project, the power of which is still hard to overestimate today? And could one person, staying in the shadows, influence the course of military actions? This story is not just an episode from Spy Chronicles. It is a carefully planned operation, still shrouded in mystery, under the codename Enigma 2. It was developed and carried out by the KGB, the Committee for State Security of the USSR. It wasn't written about in newspapers, it's not in history textbooks, but it became an important tool in the invisible struggle of the intelligence agencies of the two superpowers. Although official KGB archives remain largely closed, information about this operation emerges in declassified documents, memoirs of former employees, and independent historians' investigations. Who was behind all this? How did they manage to deceive the best counterintelligence agents of the West? Why does this operation still attract interest from historians and analysts? And what ordinary-looking train kept the CIA restless day and night? That's what we'll try to figure out. What is espionage? Right, it's the gathering of enemy secrets, the basis of any confrontation, part of competition. Whether it's a large industrial enterprise or simply the neighbor's kitchen, where a clever recipe can be learned by hiding under the window. What can you say about the military, where information about the enemy's plans was worth more than gold, because the price was human lives and the fate of a whole country? Can you imagine how strategically important industries and technologies were guarded, and what role military intelligence played in this process? Let's look back not too far. The late 1960s. Between two powerful states, the USSR and the USA, a fierce confrontation begins. For now, the Americans lead because they have precise strategic nuclear missiles in their arsenal. Dark clouds of danger gather over Soviet military facilities. What to do? How to protect the country from a nuclear catastrophe and prepare a worthy response? The Russians, as usual, approached this question with their characteristic ingenuity. What if they tried simply to fool the US guidance system? Hide their missiles so that Americans couldn't find them, while the USSR always had them ready. A secret decree was adopted to create the BZHRK, Combat Railway Missile Complex. That is, load a command post with 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles into a train and let it roam the country. Fantastic? But why not? After all, there were armored trains, and many other trains with weapons existed. Rumor has it the idea to create such a train was suggested to the Russians by the Americans themselves, who spread misinformation that they were finishing the development of a mobile missile complex. Why did they need that? The Pentagon understood that creating such a train was unrealistic. Just a waste of time and effort, but mainly huge financial costs. They couldn't even imagine that the Russians would bring the fairy tale to life, and soon such as train number 0 would appear on the USSR's railways, becoming the first of its kind in the world. An ordinary, unremarkable freight train at first glance. Thousands like it ran on Russian railways. To find which one had the clever cargo, the RT-23 missile with a range of over 10,000 kilometers, was not only difficult, but practically impossible. And one such nuclear missile was enough to destroy any European country in minutes. And if needed, reach the United States itself. Learning about the BZHRK, the Americans were horrified. Something had to be done. What would you do if you were in American intelligence's place? Obviously, they would look for every possible way to detect the ghost train. And the best would be to find a person well informed about it. But where to find him? Digging through their archives, the CIA suddenly found documents on military engineer Victor Buterin. He was the perfect candidate for espionage and, most importantly, worked as an engineer at a factory producing parts for missile engines. Needless to say, this factory was secret and located in a closed city. Do you know that closed cities existed in the USSR? No, they weren't settlements fenced with high walls and triple rows of barbed wire. They were ordinary Soviet cities, but foreigners were not allowed in. Because large defense industry plants, military warehouses, or bases were located there. But there were also ultra-secret settlements that couldn't even be found on maps, and were named with numbers: Arzamas 16, Sverdlovsk 45, Tomsk 7, Tashkent 90. They were built at a respectful distance from state borders and had special regimes. The importance of state secrets was clear even to children. And in these cities, various nuclear, biological, and even space research were conducted under strict secrecy. How did ordinary people live in closed cities? Generally, quite well. Stores had goods that people in other cities only dreamed about. Everyone's salary had a 20% bonus. You could freely walk the streets even late at night and not lock your doors. Crime was almost non-existent. Would you want to live in a place like that? But silence came at a price. Those who couldn't keep their mouths shut and told something about their amazing little town faced severe punishment. Can you imagine how tempting these invisible cities were to foreign intelligence agents? They were ready to do anything just to get information. Remember at least the year 1985 and the episode with the railway container, which, according to documents, contained boxes of handcrafted decorative flower pots. The cargo was being sent from Japan to the FRG, West Germany, speeding transit across the entire Soviet country via the Trans-Siberian Railway. As it later turned out, this was no ordinary container with harmless goods. It was a wonder laboratory, equipped with state-of-the-art technology capable of detecting nuclear sites and taking photos of the areas through which the train passed. Soviet counterintelligence uncovered the cunning plan of foreign intelligence and intercepted this train. But still, Western intelligence agents sometimes managed to get into closed cities. How? On perfectly legal grounds, as diplomats in foreign delegations. Yes, very rarely, but Moscow gave permission for such visits. That's when these James Bonds would be loaded with special equipment to sample the air and detect radiation. But all that was hardly effective and unreliable. Soviet services were no slackers either. Spies were quickly identified and sent out of the city. Constant sources of information were needed. And that could only be a person working at a top-secret facility. But to recruit such a person, you had to somehow get into the city. And they tried, through relatives, through acquaintances. Why did Western intelligence become interested in Buterin? Was it only because he lived and worked in a secret city? As it became known, Viktor's relative, a certain Kolesnikov, held a fairly important position in the Soviet Ministry of Railways. And that meant he had access to documents coordinating the movement of trains carrying military equipment from factories to military units and test ranges. But most importantly, Kolesnikov could not know about the existence of this train number 0, the plans for its routes and stops. Buterin and Kolesnikov were simply indispensable to the CIA. Is it easy to make a person betray their homeland? Let's not idealize humanity. Some could be bought with money, some with ideology. Most, of course, refused. But American intelligence knew many ways to force a person to make a deal. From ordinary blackmail and threats to the use of physical force or specially developed drugs. Which of these methods did they choose for Viktor Buterin? It turned out that he didn't have to be pressured much at all. By carefully studying Viktor's biography, American counterintelligence stumbled upon a very unpleasant episode in his past that he had carefully hidden from the KGB. If the Soviet authorities had learned about it, execution would have been inevitable. What do you think is the most important thing in the work of a spy or intelligence officer? Right, to remain unnoticed by those around you, to blend in with the crowd. No hats and dark glasses hiding half the face. No long coats either, all that only draws attention. And a newspaper with a hole to watch everything happening around, that's something out of spy novels. It's much simpler. A foreign intelligence agent is a gray, unremarkable person who can easily be lost in the crowd. Such an agent appeared in our story too. Moscow, July 1969. Evening bustle at Nikitsky Gate Square. No one pays attention to a man holding an Ogoniak magazine, calmly looking at the posters of the repeated film cinema. A few minutes later, a stranger approached him, shuffled nearby a bit, then turned and asked, "Do you happen to know where I can see the movie Eugene Onegin?" "Better to listen to Onegin at the Bolshoi Theater," was the reply. As you've guessed, that was the password. As was the magazine in his hands. And the man holding it was Victor Buterin. It was with him that the deputy CIA station chief in Moscow, Frank Smith, made contact. Their meeting lasted no more than a couple of minutes, but in that short time Smith managed to discreetly hand Buterin a note with further instructions on cooperation. A special package was prepared for Victor. The sign that it was ready to be picked up was a chalk line drawn on one of the houses in Moscow. In a phone booth on Rustaveli Street, there was a stash with a secret container holding money, special secret ink, a list of topics of interest to the CIA, and postcards with views of Moscow signed by tourists. These were cover letters. What were such letters for? Of course, to transmit gathered information. A foreign tourist strolls through Moscow, eager to share impressions with family. How to do that? Cell phones were still a thing of fantasy then. But there were beautiful postcards. You write one and send it home, let them enjoy the views and read the message. The Americans figured out how to use this for their purposes. Buterin was supposed to write, between the lines, in invisible ink, the information expected of him on those postcards and send them to the addresses already written on them. He received new instructions every month. Why were the Americans so sure that both Buterin and his relative Kolesnikov would cooperate and not run straight to the KGB? It's all about the secret that these people so carefully hid. What kind of compromise did the CIA dig up? Oh, it was truly a black dossier. Had it fallen into the hands of the KGB, Buterin's and Kolesnikov's careers and peaceful lives would have been over for good. It turns out that during World War II, both of them collaborated with the special services of Nazi Germany. It should be added that at that time the Soviet KGB worked very efficiently. A large division was searching for World War II traitors and was quite successful in this direction. Many war criminals were found, and all received deserved punishment. Some were even executed. The CIA had no doubt, not only money but also fear would force Buterin to become a traitor. The Americans underestimated the Russian soul. How did a simple engineer become a significant figure in a dangerous game? What was his role in a large-scale military operation? Before the start of World War II, Buterin worked in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, in one of the laboratories. In 1941, when he was just over 30 years old, he was drafted and after training was sent behind enemy lines. But very soon the young man was captured by the Germans. After harsh interrogations and psychological pressure from the Nazis, Victor agreed to become their agent. After training at the elite Abwehr school, Abwehr, German military intelligence, he was sent back into Soviet territory. But Buterin did not intend to become a traitor and immediately reported his recruitment to Soviet counterintelligence. What is a military radio game? It is a well-planned operation in which an agent with a radio was first identified behind their own lines, then persuaded to switch sides. Soviet counterintelligence was among the best at these radio games. Over the course of the war, they conducted about 200 such operations, neutralizing hundreds of enemy spies. Disinformation was sent westward skillfully, new spies were identified. They decided to use Buterin in such a radio game, naming it Riddle. The operation's goal was clear: to feed disinformation to the highest level of German intelligence and possibly even lure some Abwehr professionals into the Moscow region. And it began. One day Victor told the Nazis about his relative Kolesnikov, whose position gave him access to very important strategic information. More precisely, plans for the movement of military equipment and personnel, and therefore information about upcoming maneuvers on the front. The Germans carefully verified the information and, having confirmed that Kolesnikov really held a high position in the People's Commissariat, gave orders to recruit him. The Nazis had two main goals: to get secret information from a high-ranking official and, if possible, to eliminate Stalin. By the way, they decided to recruit Victor's relative under the guise of Americans, correctly assuming that, knowing Germany's true situation at the time, he would hardly agree to cooperate with them. Soon Buterin informed the Nazis that he had convinced his relative to pass them important information. But in return, the relative wanted a large sum in dollars and a U.S. passport. The Nazis agreed, and in spring they received word that Kolesnikov had obtained a secret plan for military movements over the next several months. And he was ready to hand over these documents. Germany was pleased and sent their agent into Soviet territory. But he was immediately arrested and sentenced to death. However, the Abwehr agent survived, ending up in a prisoner of war camp. If only they had known that this almost ruined a global military operation in the future. The Nazis never managed to get the documents, and Victor reported that the decisive Russian strike was expected in the southern sector of the front that summer. As you guessed, that was strategic deception. When Soviet troops launched their offensive on the Central Front and in Belarus in June 1944, the German command was shocked. No one was expecting them there. Suffering huge losses, the Germans retreated, and the Soviet army reached Europe. The last radio message from the Germans was received on April 5, 1945. After that, they had no time for their agents. By the way, the Abwehr never found out that Buterin was a Soviet spy. The war ended, Victor returned as an engineer to a factory, and Operation Riddle remained only in the memories of counterintelligence officers and in dusty folders on KGB archive shelves. Who would have known that it would start again a quarter century later, only this time with the USA? Who started playing the tricky multi-step game with the CIA? How did they manage to make American intelligence believe the disinformation? Let's return to Moscow in late autumn 1969. At the post of first deputy head of KGB counterintelligence was Major General Grigory Grigorenko. He would lead the counterintelligence department for 13 years, a period known as its golden decade. Grigorenko was rightfully considered a master of radio games with the enemy, combining a keen mind and subtle intuition with a rare ability to understand and feel another person's emotional state. Grigorenko instantly understood who could be trusted, how to manage an agent, and how to feed the enemy disinformation while minimizing risk. His operations sometimes resembled elegant psychological performances or chess matches, with the best minds of Western intelligence agencies as opponents. Grigorenko began one of the riskiest and most complicated operations, Riddle 2, involving a modest Soviet engineer named Viktor Buterin. Back then, no one knew that this game would drag on for a long time and turn out to be far more dangerous than it seemed at first. 1970, the first cipher message for the CIA from Viktor Buterin. It contained lies mixed with truth, information that his relative Kolesnikov had taken an important post in the Ministry of Railways, and details about Buterin's own work at a defense factory in Perm. The combination of real facts and disinformation, that's exactly how it was planned. You can't send pure lies, they're easy to verify, but no one intended to reveal all military secrets either. It was a delicate game, with Buterin as bait to mislead the CIA and buy time for creating a secret weapon, a combat railway missile system, the BZHRK. At the same time, information was gathered about the actions of American agents on Soviet territory. How exactly did Buterin come under the radar of American intelligence? There is a version that the CIA was helped by the archives of Reinhard Gehlen, a former Wehrmacht general who supervised intelligence on the Eastern Front. In spring 1945, he copied valuable data from German special services, documents, photographs, microfilms, and surrendered to the Americans. In exchange for cooperation, Gehlen proposed creating a new intelligence service in West Germany aimed against the Soviet Union. Most likely, it was from him that the CIA received information about Buterin. It is possible that it was the talented intelligence officer Grigory Grigorenko who managed to calculate the moves of the fascist intelligence many years ahead. However, the key to this mystery is still kept in the secret departments of Russian special services. The Americans had no doubt that Buterin would work for them, selling strategic secrets. Fearing exposure, Victor would try to leave the Soviet Union. But for that, he needed a lot of money. And where could a simple Soviet engineer get it? What information about the BZHRK did the CIA get from Buterin? And how did it help Soviet engineers? Work on the missile complex was carried out in Dnipropetrovsk. The lead designers were brothers Vladimir and Alexei Utkins. The first worked on the carrier rocket, the second on the launch complex and the cars for the missile train. The task was not easy. A regular train car would not support a rocket weighing almost 135 tons. And the rails? They would simply spread apart under such weight. However, Soviet engineers coped with these problems. But more on that later. The USA decided not to fall behind the USSR, and in autumn 1969 began developing models of their own invisible trains. Naturally, any developments in this field caused huge interest for them. Soviet counterintelligence could not miss such a chance, and very soon disinformation mixed with some truth began flowing to the States through Victor Buterin. The Americans waited anxiously. Through secret dead drops, Buterin was supplied with a camera and a radio receiver tuned to a CIA frequency. He usually received instructions from the same Gehlen Center in Munich. The caches were planted, ciphers processed, and communication channels maintained by a few American residents in Moscow. The CIA did not even suspect how futile their agents' efforts were. The KGB was carefully distracting their attention. By the way, that was also one of the tasks of Operation Riddle 2. Almost 5 years passed like this. By the mid-1970s, the construction of the secret Soviet ghost train was actively ongoing, but it was still too early to speak about the readiness of the BZHRK. Especially since the railways had to be upgraded by replacing wooden sleepers with concrete ones. It is clear that such large-scale work could not go unnoticed by Western intelligence agencies. The KGB faced a new question: how to remove spies from the places where this train number 0 was to be tested. Again, Buterin and his relative Kolesnikov were needed. Once more, disinformation was fed to the Americans, allegedly received from Kolesnikov, that rockets for the nuclear train were ready in a small Siberian town. The CIA sent its agents there, who tried to get into the ultra-secret, well-guarded city. Meanwhile, the BZHRK continued to be quietly tested in Dnipropetrovsk. After this, the Americans began to have doubts. Was their agent playing a double game? They started to trust his reports less and demanded clarification of how the information was obtained. Once they even became interested in Victor's past. Had the CIA cracked Riddle 2? Or had someone betrayed Buterin? It turned out this was an echo from the first Riddle operation. Unexpectedly, a German agent who survived a Soviet camp appeared. In 1955, the Germans were amnestied in the Soviet Union. He returned to West Germany and began working at Gehlen Center. CIA officers studying Nazi archives suddenly came across his dossier and learned that he had worked with Buterin and knew him well. The German was interrogated and told that he had seen Victor communicating with Russian counterintelligence. The Soviet agent had never come so close to failure. Would the Riddle 2 project have to be shut down? So much hard work, effort, and time wasted? No, Grigory Grigorenko could not allow this and again showed his unconventional thinking. At the next radio session, Buterin expressed outrage at the Americans' mistrust and said that proof of his loyalty would be the highly secret information he managed to obtain. But he would pass it only to the resident. The CIA believed him. At the appointed time, Frank Smith, the CIA deputy resident in Moscow, appeared at the designated place. Yes, the very same one who first made contact with Victor 5 years earlier. As soon as Smith received the book with the microfilm, he was immediately detained by KGB officers and given an order: leave the Soviet Union within 48 hours. Operation Riddle 2 was ready for a logical conclusion. But Grigorenko was not satisfied. Sometime later, in the hall of the Polytechnic Museum in Moscow, one of the Soviet state security officers spoke to the audience. Talking about Western spy practices on Soviet soil, he briefly mentioned a recent case when the KGB arrested a Soviet citizen trying to pass important information to American intelligence. The citizen was sentenced to 8 years in prison, and the foreigner was expelled from the country. Of course, this was another move by Soviet counterintelligence to remove Viktor Buterin from the game. Since foreigners were present in the hall, the CIA immediately learned about this story. But if Buterin was arrested, he was not a KGB agent. Who then was the traitor? This mystery remained unsolved for the CIA. And Viktor Buterin, having changed his passport data and biography, disappeared somewhere in the Russian expanses. Only in 2010 was his name declassified, but his fate remains a mystery. What about Kolesnikov, Viktor's relative? In summer 1977, preparations were underway in Paris for the visit of USSR leader Leonid Brezhnev. Among one of the Soviet delegations arriving early was Kolesnikov, a representative of the Ministry of Railways. The CIA immediately suspected that he was the very relative of Buterin through whom valuable information passed. To establish contact with him, Frank Smith, the same CIA officer expelled from the USSR, arrived from the USA. Smith cautiously spoke with Kolesnikov, hinting at a familiar relative. The official frowned but said nothing. When the men were alone, Kolesnikov irritably remarked that Buterin had been carrying out CIA assignments but ended up in prison due to American mistakes. He immediately hinted that he was ready to continue cooperation in exchange for a large sum in foreign currency. Smith agreed but insisted on testing Kolesnikov by CIA specialists. Of course, Kolesnikov was immediately subjected to polygraph tests, a lie detector. The polygraph is an old invention. It was used by ancient Indians and Chinese. It does not have intelligence, it is a mechanism with preset settings. It monitors sweating, breathing, heartbeat, and similar indicators. While some people invent more parameters for the polygraph, others find ways to deceive it. For a well-trained person, it is not difficult at all. As you guessed, behind the mask of Kolesnikov was a KGB officer. General Grigorenko was setting traps for the Americans again. He knew that Buterin's relative, who helped obtain secret information, would not escape close CIA attention. Grigorenko also suspected various tests. And for an intelligence officer, a lie detector test was an easy walk in the autumn park. Therefore, the Americans, trusting the polygraph, made sure that Kolesnikov had no relation to counterintelligence. This meant they had a chance again to receive secret information. No matter what you say, Operation Riddle 2 continued. And disinformation flowed like a river straight from the Ministry of Railways. By the way, it is still unknown whether there really was such a high-ranking official named Kolesnikov or if this is a mythical figure invented by counterintelligence. A mystery. Meanwhile, how are the works on the ghost train progressing? Vladimir Utkin and his colleagues had several problems which, by 1982, were solved. The first was the rocket's dimensions. The car with the launch unit could not be longer than 24 meters, but where to get such a short rocket? After long consideration, they designed a folding shape, making the fairing inflatable and the nozzles extendable. Another nuance. How to launch the rocket so that both the crew and the BZHRK remain intact. They recalled the mortar method. First, a powder charge pushes the rocket out, then at 40 to 50 meters altitude, the automation turns on the main solid fuel mini-engine. The ghost train consisted of 17 cars. These were 3 cars with launch modules and 3 rockets, each with 10 nuclear warheads. Behind them was a command module made of 7 cars. Separately, the main power source, a diesel power station car. Then a radio center car, warehouse cars, fuel cars, dormitory cars. All of this was pulled by 3 diesel locomotives moving in a single coupling. One such complex equaled a missile regiment. Although the train did not look very different from a regular freight train, and its weight, despite the equipment, did not exceed 2,500 tons, while an average freight train sometimes weighs almost 6,000 tons. Train number 0 could travel 1,000 kilometers per day. It was given way everywhere, always prioritized. Ordinary Soviet citizens could not even imagine that past their stations, where grandmothers sold perch fish wrapped in newspaper, raspberry jam in jars, and other goodies, past a train capable of wiping out half of continents from the face of the earth. And the Americans suspected the BZHRK, even trying to find it from space using satellites. But how to detect a train well disguised as a regular freight train, speeding on general-purpose railways? So how did Operation Riddle 2 end? The CIA received distorted information from Kolesnikov for a long time. Only after 6 years was Operation Riddle 2 decided to be stopped. Soviet military secrets remained undisclosed. But Grigory Grigorenko decided to leave the game in style. It happened in Moscow in May 1983. CIA officer Louis Thomas, who covered himself with the status of an attaché, found a note from Viktor Buterin in his car. Viktor said he was free and demanded payment for his work. Through Kolesnikov, the Americans agreed and indicated a stash with money. On June 2, 1983, Thomas was detained in a Moscow park while trying to plant a container with 300,000 rubles, an enormous sum at that time, indicating the value of the information received from Buterin. Operation Riddle 2 really ended impressively, and very soon planned tests of the nuclear train began. By 1987, 3 such complexes were running on Russian roads, which was an unpleasant surprise for the USA. To counter the new threat, the Pentagon had to deploy a whole network of satellite reconnaissance. Operation Riddle 2 lasted more than 40 years, and the scale of disinformation that reached the CIA remains classified to this day. What do you expect? It's a mystery.